can't really. What did I do with my camera?
I was waiting to find it.
Did I give you my camera, Spencer?
I didn't get it done.
Yeah. Well, I thought I had it.
So it was fired.
That's right, because I'm.
I'm hoping that I can have some more to go home to my grandma to stream this. And pushing on doing some else. So I'd like to go home. But, I it sounds like that I used to go and work for them. Jess Wallace. But that's like so. She has a Padawan braid. And I'm really annoyed about and she said that she'll ever come. Yes, I like Star Wars, but not as much as to know the rules of the Padawan braid. That yeah. I'm not sure what
Did your student come see you tonight?
Yes. So that I thought that she was I have. Yes, I'm gonna run to the ladies. No,
We'll wait for you to get back.
Yeah.
Okay. This recollection. I'll take you up on that. Hello. How are you? How are you? Good. Been a while. Been a while.
Quite a bit.
somebody's serious.
We didn't get any food.
What was that?
We didn't get any food.
Oh, yeah. Just the video guy.
So how do you know
Just became friends with her about, oh my gosh, 17 years ago, we would go to sunsets together. Susie.
Okay, Susie.
Okay, very
I've heard your name.
This one is
Who talks about my friend Susan?
She does. You probably know my daughter how to do makeup for Tarzan. She got long red hair.
Wow. I wasn't in that class very much, but I inspire myself. Somebody's good. Expensive.
Spencer,
What was that? What? Oh, that's not. You're being sarcastic. Huh? You're being sarcastic.
I wonder if I'll ever
Yeah. Well, I haven't started yet. They said it's not going to be longer than 15 minutes. The battery is only at 90 minutes. Yeah. Like, it was like, so. Hopefully it'll go longer. He's using the performance hall. They're doing a show down there at the street.
If you've ever seen the movie Out of Africa, that's a movie with Robert
Usually during the show, it's pretty easy. It's just before and after. Usually we're setting stuff up in the performance hall.
Are you recording it now?
Yeah. Just because, so I don't miss the beginning. It has 355 minutes of just space. There's nothing on the camera.
Good afternoon. Whoa, that is live. So I'd like to extend on behalf of Dean Craig Jessup and Ken Risch a welcome to our second faculty forum. It's my honor to introduce you. My name's Nick Morrison, and I'm one of the associate deans of the college. And we're excited to have this faculty forum this evening. Our presenter this evening, Nancy Hills, was born in a Studebaker in San Mateo, California. It really says that right here. Nancy has since then traveled all over the United States. Sounds like that started early, Nancy. And her favorite designs as a faculty member at Utah State, where she heads the costume design program, include Les Liaisons d'Angélus, Good Night Desdemona, Good Morning Juliet, Pride and Prejudice, Cabaret, To Kill a Mockingbird, A Little Night Music, The Miser, and many, many others. Nancy spent a year on sabbatical in the Northwest, designing Beauty and the Beast at the Northwest Children's Theater in Oregon, and Hamlet for the Calaveras Repertory Theater in California. She received the 2005 Kennedy Center ACTF Faculty Fellowship, and recently she designed for the Egyptian Theater's Peter Pan, The End of the Horizon at Salt Lake's Plan B Theater Company, and Anne of Green Gables and Inherit the Wind at the Grand in Salt Lake City. During the 2008 lyric season, Nancy's costumes were on display in The Dresser, one of them worn by a gentleman in the front row, and Beau Geste. She is the mother of twin boys, Douglas and Tristan. Nancy addresses us tonight as the 2013 Janet Arnold Awardee of the Society of Antiquaries of London, where she will spend part of her sabbatical next year, completing a research project and pattern book. We're delighted that she will share some elements of her research process with us this evening. It's wonderful to have Nancy as a colleague, and I know that you all know and love her just as I do. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nancy Hills.
Anyway, I can get a couple of you guys to scoot over here. I feel like you got, oh, the theater folks, thank you. Yes, I appreciate that. Oh, yes, see, that works out. It's much better. Don't you think? Now you guys are like in the nosebleed section. No, but we can still see.
Yeah, we got a great
Okay. Paintings and statues tell us important information about the history of clothing. Surviving garments reveal even more. Every crease, stitch, and stain in a piece of clothing supplies information about the individual who wore it and the era in which it was worn. The garment is a visual, tactile biography of its wearer. Surviving garments help us to bridge the gap between then and now, and allow us to encounter the past at first hand. As stated by Linda Baumgartner, the curator at Williamsburg, an 18th century suit or an heirloom dress is far more than a tangible survivor. It is an event in history that continues to happen. Molded by the body that wore it, wrinkled by years of use, carefully hand-stitched, stained by 200-year-old perspiration, clothing is the most intimately human of the surviving decorative arts. The artist William Hogarth believed it was possible to know the very minds of the people by their dress. Last year, I was honored, oh, there it goes, learning curve. Last year, I was honored to receive a grant from the Society of Antiquaries in London called the Janet Arnold Award. This May, I am a guest speaker at the Society of Antiquaries, presenting a talk much the same as this one called Historic Dress, a project inspired by Janet Arnold. Janet Arnold, who passed away in 1998, was an artist, teacher, and designer. Her technical skills, along with a focus on period accuracy, made the study of historic clothing a serious discipline. She thought that the understanding of dress depended on the close, careful examination of existing garments. When I was a university student, I was introduced to the books of Janet Arnold, and they became the foundation of my knowledge of historic patterns. One Christmas when I was in graduate school, the top of my Christmas list was Arnold's Queen Elizabeth's Wardrobe Unlocked. Every costume shop I've ever worked in has Arnold's patterns of fashion. And I can look through the USU costume storage and know which garments are influenced by the patterns from those books. Earlier this spring, I had the opportunity to do a workshop in Italy, and I met a woman who works in the costume shop at La Scala. We attempted a conversation with my really broken Italian and her broken English, and when I told her I worked on a Janet Arnold grant, she lit up. Oh, so che illi Janet Arnold? I know the books of Janet Arnold. We had an international language with which our translator was unfamiliar, the language of historic clothing. As part of this grant, I have been developing patterns from existing garments from 2 clothing collections in the United Kingdom. One is the Snows Hill collection, made well known by Janet Arnold's books, housed at Barrington Hall near Leominster in Herefordshire. Here are USU students Hong Ji Zhu and McKenna Greener with a gown from 1780, which we will look at later. The other clothing collection is in the Hereford Museum and Art Gallery, housed in the Museum Resource Center in Hereford. Again, here are USU students Hong Ji and McKenna in the stores of the Resource Center examining an 18th century waistcoat. Althea Mackenzie curates both of these collections. I met Althea 5 years ago when Darren Brooks and I were doing research for our presentation on 18th century interiors and clothing entitled Big Hair, Big Chair. Althea, yeah, it was pretty funny. Althea has not only shared her extraordinary expertise on the subject of historic clothing and textiles, but also her generous friendship. I have already spent time with 32 garments, carefully exploring and translating them into paper patterns. I have chosen 11 of them, of the 32, and recreated them in monochromatic mock-ups to show today, modeled by members of the Interior Design Program students of Darren Brooks and Susie Tibbetts. Spencer Potter, Hong Ji Zhu, and Mandolin Browning, who are MFA graduate students in the USU Theater Arts Department, and my dear friend and valued colleague, Michelle Bradford, have made these garments. I can't believe what has been done. Okay, deep breath. patterns have been photographed by Susie Tibbetts, and all are part of a project that I am working on over the next year. I will complete my collection of patterns and compile them along with practical information and any discoveries I may have made. The goal is to put them all in a published form. Almost every one of the garments on which I work provided me with interesting insights and challenging questions. I plan on pursuing the answers to the questions as part of my next phase of research. Here's an example of one of the gowns I explored. Oh, there's the patterns. Isn't that beautiful? Susie took that picture. Isn't that great? Okay. Here's an example of one of the gowns I explored. This is a colorful silk gown made in the 18th century from the Hereford Coiling Collection. The silk is from the Spitalfields section of London, where silk was made by French Huguenots. The precious fabric was carefully pieced together, even cutting out and placing some of the beautiful flowers in more prominent parts of the garment. Interestingly, this fabric is somewhat older than the style that it's fashioned into, and most likely was reconstructed from an earlier garment, a practice common in the 18th century. Many of these Spitalfield silks were woven between the 1730s and the 1760s. Here is a fairly typical Spitalfield silk that was made in 1744, similar to the fabric in the gown. This gown was pulled up into a polonaise, a style that became popular in the late 1770s and 1780s, at least 20 to 30 years after the fabric was originally woven. There is a long loop of string attached to the inside back, placed at the waist, which slips around the bottom of the hem and hooks up on a button at the back of the waist, pulling the back of the skirt up into a draped polonaise. The stitching in this gown is actually rather sloppily done. And I can almost hear a young woman saying to her mother, "Oh, I don't need to do this over. Who's going to ever see it?" I had a frustrating day with this dress, and I was trying to figure out the shape of the back pleats. They are securely sewed down, and so clues had to be eked out from other parts of the fabric. The pleats in the gown can be measured and determined by measuring the missing parts of the flower. I can figure out how wide those pleats are. We can't leave this garment without looking at parts of the garment that are joyful. That includes the carefully tied fly fringe, which flanks the roping along the center front and along the sleeve ruffles. The fly fringe could have been harvested off the original garment, or it could have been made for this one. But the quality of the sewing was much better than the garment, which leads me to believe that a very different hand altered the gown and made the fly fringe. Perhaps it was purchased from the craftsman. In general, when I begin working on a garment, I take it out of its acid-free box or drawer, in which it was carefully packed with acid-free paper, making sure my hands are thoroughly washed. I often do a quick sketch of the garment, and I use this sketching process as an exercise in observation. I might even conjecture the shape of the patterns as I look at the garment and sketch them out. I take out a tape measure and measure as many points as I can to obtain the correct shape of each pattern piece. I cut the pieces out of gridded paper and compare them to the original garment. If the dress or gown has pleats or tucks, I will use one of the techniques like the Spitalfields gown. If there are no apparent landmarks, I conjecture the size of the pleat from the amount of area that appears to have interrupted in grain line. The width of the original fabric impacts the way a garment is cut, and usually the most conservative method was used. As fabric was a precious commodity, you couldn't run down to the store and just pick up a few more yards. If I could determine the width of the original fabric, I often could sort out how the pieces were cut. Many of these gowns, the full width of the fabric was used in the panels for the skirts, and you can see the selvage or the woven edge on either side of the panels. The garment is constructed with the center back seam, here, placed on the selvage. That allowed the back opening to not have to be turned and tacked. Each piece of the pattern gets compared to the original garment many times. The pattern pieces are drawn out on gridded paper, notated with the name of the pattern, the grain line, how many pieces are cut, whether it has seam allowance, how the pieces are fit together with each other. I don't add seam allowance because seam allowance was determined by the amount of fabric one had and at the digression of the pattern maker. All patterns and notes live in their own envelope with a photo of the garment on the outside. Now we will take a look at the 11 garments that were made from the patterns I took at Snows Hill and Hereford collection. We'll look at photographs of the original garment and discuss something interesting that I found when I see the mock-up on the model. Because of the garments today are white, cream, beige, ecru, taupe, off-white, etc. The garments that were originally white look the most like themselves. If the garment was quite colorful, I'll show you a close-up of the original fabric. In all cases, I tried to find fabric that was as close to as I could to the fiber content of the original. Towards the end of the 18th century, extraordinary silk and elaborate trims were replaced with a lighter, more functional neoclassical streamlined silhouette. Cotton became the fabric of the new era. The first garments we realized for this project were both from that decade. The modern classical Barrington Hall, designed by Henry Holland, grounds by Capability Brown, could have been the home for the following garments. Jill and Becky? Cotton weaving advanced with the Hargrave spinning jenny in 1764 and Crompton's spinning mule in 1779 drastically increased the time spent in spinning yarn for weaving and advanced the cotton manufacturing of these garments. The discoveries at Pompeii and Herculaneum helped to fuel the neoclassical revival with its simple draped lines and subtle use of white. And it would be a disservice not to recognize that one of the repercussions of the cotton craze fueled a slave trade economy. This white cotton caraco was a short jacket worn for informal occasions at home. And the caraco worn by Becky is, I'm going to run over here and show you, gathered up at the waist, gathered across under the bust, and gathered at the neckline. I'm not going to do this anymore. What was interesting about this is that these drawstrings could be easily adjusted to accommodate a growing abdomen during pregnancy. It is easy to see the hand stitching on this cuff and the homemade button and buttonhole 60 years before any of these women would have known about a sewing machine. The button was made from a small metal ring wrapped in cotton thread. This style of button was called a Dorset wheel. Michelle made the Dorset wheel on Becky's cuff. These are the patterns I developed from the original garment. This pattern was probably laid out on a piece of fabric that was 32 inches wide. I say that because the widest piece is 32 inches. That's something I noticed last night. You keep finding new things out every time you open up one of these patterns. Thank you. Jill? Floral prints originating from India permeated wallpaper, upholstery, and lightweight cotton gowns. This simple gown, also devoid of decoration, but gently pulled up on the sides, created a polonaise style. The fabric for this is an entwining floral pattern. The fabric for the gown from which this pattern was taken was either imported from India or adapted from India prints woven in Europe. Most prestigious were the ones imported from India. At the side back, under the skirt, near the waist, are 2 long ties that are threaded through 2 loops and attached to draw the skirt up into a drape. This is a slightly different style of polonaise than the earlier Spitalfield skirt. In keeping